So, you got a bottom pick in your ranked lobby but don't know how to support? Well then, this video is for you. So this is a continuation of my comprehensive role guide videos. I've already covered jungle and solo lane previously, so I'll leave links in the description to those videos if you want to watch those as well. Support was a highly requested role to cover next, so let's get right into it. I'm going to split the guide up into a number of different subsections to make it easier to follow. I'll leave timestamps on screen and in a pinned comment as well for those who just want to skip to a specific section, but here's the stuff I'm going to be covering throughout the guide. First up, we'll cover the basics of the role. After that, your role in the game and your team comp. Next up, gods and items. Then, the early game and the laning phase. And finally, team play and late game team fighting. If you're already familiar with the very basics of the support role in Conquest, then you can probably skip the first section or two and just move straight on to gods and items. But if you're completely new to the role, I'd recommend watching the video all the way through. There's some pretty useful information for beginners at the start. So let's start off with the basics of the role. So as a support in Smite, your job is to, you guessed it, support your team. A support resides in the duo lane in Conquest along with the ADC, and will look to protect them and get them ahead in the early stages of the game. The key skills you need for this role will be good map awareness, knowledge of a variety of gods, team play, and being able to play Guardians quite well. Okay, moving on to your role in the game. The support role is vital for any team comp and shouldn't be taken lightly. You'll be the main source of protection for your carries throughout the game, and your job is to provide as good assistance as you can. Different gods do this in different ways, of course. Some are more peel oriented and some are more aggressive and CC focused, but you should always be thinking, how does this benefit my team when making a play? It's often a tough role to play well if you're used to other roles that are more focused on individual play, but hopefully after this video you'll be able to play a little bit better when you get support. Okay, moving on to gods and items. In Smite, the support is almost always a tank. Since supports are usually somewhat of a frontline, it helps to be tanky, which is why Guardians and some warriors are the most popular picks for the role. Some other gods can work sometimes as well, but tanks are the premier gods for this role. In terms of Guardians, pretty much every Guardian except Cabrakan works well as a support. There are of course varying playstyles within the class. For example, Ares and Cerberus are much more aggressive damage focused Guardians that look to kill people, whereas gods like Geb, Khepri and Ganesha generally are more peel and CC focused and look to protect their team mostly. So it's important to identify your god's playstyle so you can play them most effectively and use their strong points to win your games. In terms of warrior supports, the most common warriors will be Amaterasu, Guan Yu and Odin. Others can work, but these three are the most commonly seen due to their big teamfight presence. Some healer mages are also tried out in the role a bit. Mostly Hell works pretty well, but you can kind of argue that Afro could work too, but you mostly want to be sticking to tanks when playing support. Okay, moving on to items. I'm going to be approaching this section from the perspective of a Guardian. Other classes might need to change their build slightly because they're different, power users or something like that. But a lot of the good support items right now are neutral and can be built across all classes, so let's kick it off with starting builds. So as always, you have a few different options for viable starting builds in this role. You pretty much always want Guardian's Blessing on every god. The extra golden sustain is just too important to pass up early. So after that, you're left with 800 gold. In my mind, there are two viable options with the remaining gold after your blessing. One option will be starting a tier 1 item and buying potions. This could be tier 1 boots to get those online as early as possible. It could also be starting off something like Gauntlet of Thebes if you want to rush it first item. You would then just fill up on potions with the rest of the remaining gold that you have. The other option will be the Chalice of the Oracle start, which will be obviously buying Chalice of the Oracle and then something like a Health Chalice or just some other potions. This means you pass up the tier 1 item which slows down your build a bit, but it also gives you a lot of early wards and could save you gold in the long run if you place a lot of wards, as you don't need to buy them. If you struggle with remembering to buy wards in the support role, this is a good start to get you into the habit of warding a bit more. If you're doing this start, you can also drop 2 wards at the beginning of the match somewhere in the jungle, and then quickly back and refill the chalice and have 2 more free wards to place when they expire. So after your starting builds, you're probably going to want to go boots as your first item. You could rush a full item like Gauntlet of Thieves before boots, but it is a bit risky. In terms of boots, for Guardians you usually want to get Traveler's Shoes, but you can also go cooldown boots as well if you want to for some extra CDR. Tank boots are also a somewhat viable option if you feel you're going to get focused early on and you need the defense. But the movement speed from Travelers is great for rotations and getting out of base faster, and the CDR from Shoes of Focus is basically always useful. I usually like Traveler's Shoes on most Guardians because I can get CDR later in my build anyway, and the early movement speed is really good. After your boots, auras are pretty much the only way to go for supports right now. This might change in the future, but as of the recording, auras are insanely strong and pretty much mandatory for any support build. Gauntlet of Thebes is great to rush second item to get the stacks done early on. You can then continue into Sovereignty and maybe Heart Ward if they have a lot of magical damage, like a Hebo jungle with a mage mid for example. If they only have a Guardian and a Mage though for magical damage, Heart Ward isn't really essential and you can skip it if you want, but it's decent even just against a Mage. After you're done with those items, your build can kinda go in a million different directions and you'll need to be adapting to the situation in the game you're in. Some great items for most supports will be Spirit Robe or Mantle of Discord if you feel you need the defense against CC chains and things like that if you're getting focused. Emperor's Armor is honestly pretty underrated right now with how hard Phoenixes are to take, so you could buy that. Pestilence is of course good against healers or heavy lifesteal based comps. Jade Emperor's Crown is still okay against a lot of physicals, but it's often outclassed by Sovereignty lately. Voidstone can also be good to help out your mage with a bit more penetration, especially if you have a double mage comp like a Freya ADC or a Hebo jungle for example. Midgardian Mail is actually a really strong counter to basic attack gods with the buff it just got, and it should be your go-to against heavy basic attack comps in my opinion. Wing Blade is always great if slows are giving you trouble. Shogun's Kasari is good if your team needs some extra attack speed. Helps with structure pushes and stuff like that as well, does Shogun's. Genji's Guard is a good CDR item if your god relies heavily on having the cooldowns up, but it is a bit of a selfish item to get. Talisman of Energy is not really seeing much play, but it seems okay after its buffs now. It's not the best item in the world, but extra movement speed and attack speed can be useful in later game teamfights. So any of those items I listed can round out your final 2 or 3 slots in a build, just build them like situationally as you feel like you need them. A full build example might look something like this, for those who are just looking for a decent example build to use in a pinch. But make sure you're building according to the situation as well, that's a big part of it. I'll just quickly talk about relics as well. For supports, most of the time you want relics that can affect an entire team, because that's how you can impact the fight the most, so things like Heavenly Wings, Magic Shell for buffing your team, or Horrific Emblem for debuffing the enemy team are really good. Belt of Frenzy is also not too bad either. It doesn't really see all that much play right now, but it's really good for like burning down objectives like towers and Fire Giant, or even just popping it in the middle of a fight for some extra damage on your team. Meditation also doesn't really see much play right now, but it can be an okay substitute for Shell, as they both kind of give you a sustain almost in that kind of way, but Meditation is more like permanent health. Blink Rune is good on certain ones that need it for engage, like your Mia or Geb might want this for engaging with the CC. Cursed Dank is good against healers as always, and Phantom Veil is good against Odin. Okay, moving on to early game and laning phase tips. So in the early game, the support usually starts with the ADC right now in duo lane. This could change, but for now that's how it is. You'll be clearing waves and taking jungle counts with them and looking to pressure out the enemy duo. The way this laning phase goes depends a lot on your picks and also your ADC's pick. More aggressive gods like Fafnir, Ares, Artios, Cerberus, etc. will want to be pressuring out the enemy laners as much as possible and taking a lead in the early game. Whereas on the flip side, more defensive or late game focused gods like Geb, Khepri or Ganesha will want to play more defensively and just look to farm safely and not get too far behind. Of course, there's the ADC to consider too, and the combination of your playstyle between you and your ADC will determine how you play the laning phase. For example, if you're quite a defensive late game god like Geb, but you have an early game ADC like Anhur, you might still want to play aggressively and look for kills because your ADC can do a lot of damage. Like, just keep in mind that you may need to adjust from your normal playstyle in order to make a cohesive duo lane with your ADC. It's much better to be on the same page with your ADC than to just be doing your own thing and, like, even if you're making the right plays, just doing your own thing and not being cohesive with your ADC won't make the lane go very well for you. In terms of laning, try not to take any last hits on the minions, because of course this delays your Guardian's Blessing stacks and it also means your ADC gets less gold. So try as much as you can to not take minions when your ADC is not there, as them getting farm is often key to you winning later on when they join the teamfights. A question I always see people bringing up when talking about support is, when should I be rotating from duo lane and how often should I be rotating? It's really a difficult question to answer as there's no set time or situation that you need to quote start rotating. It's dependent on so many factors that it'll change every game. It's more something you get a feel for after playing support for a while. Like, you'll need to be paying attention to your team's overall goals and when they're at their strongest, which stage of the game. You need to be rotating ideally when the team starts trying to take team fights and or do objectives. This can be earlier or later depending on your team comp, so if you start to see your team grouping up a little bit looking to pressure, you might want to start rotating as a fight could likely break out over an objective or something like that. Also, don't get hung up too much on what the enemy support is doing. I see a lot of people who seem scared to rotate to a fight just because the enemy support's still sat in duo lane. Don't worry about that too much. If you think you can make an impact on a fight by rotating, then do it. It doesn't matter if your ADC gets pushed to tower for a bit and loses some minions if your team gets a couple of kills from your rotation. Okay, moving on to late game team fighting and team play. Support is very unique when it comes to teamfighting, as it requires an extreme amount of awareness to play at top level. You need to be aware of and keep track of pretty much every person on both teams while still being aware of your surroundings. Of course, you'll be peeling for the most part as a support and keeping your carries alive, so they can do the damage safely. As with the laning phase, how you play teamfights depends a lot on your character. Gods like Khepri are focused almost solely on peel and keeping their team alive, in which case you need to stick with your team at all costs. You don't need to be doing damage to people when your ADC is safe and can do damage for you. Other more aggressive guardians can also work as a sort of second frontline alongside the solo laner or whatever other tank you have on your team, but you will still need to be aware of your team, and if they need help, drop off chasing a target and go to help them. Most of the time, keeping them alive is actually more important than securing a kill, especially in the case of a hunter. Often the solo laner or the assassin can clean up a kill, you don't need to go chasing it around. In terms of who you should be peeling for the most, that depends on your composition as well. You'll be wanting to protect the target you think will have the biggest impact on a fight. Not necessarily the guy with the most kills, but the guy who, if kept alive, can carry a fight on their own. Oftentimes in late game fights this is the hunter, which is usually who I prioritise first for peel, as the hunter is infinitely more important than every other member of the team when it comes to taking objectives like towers, phoenixes, fire giant, etc. after the fight is won. I'd much rather have a Hatchiman alive to take Fire Giant than like a Scylla for example, because he just out DPS's mages by a lot. Hunter Structure Push and better DPS makes them an invaluable asset to have alive post team fight for exactly those reasons I just mentioned, which is why they're often a prime target for enemy assassins or warriors looking to dive the backline. You gotta pay attention to their positioning and ideally their cooldowns if you can try and keep track of them. For example, if both your mid and your ADC are getting dive, but your mid has a dash available or Aegis or something like that and your ADC doesn't, help the ADC. That way you got a better chance of getting them both to safety. Quick note, if you find yourself getting focused out or picked at the start of a fight, don't be afraid to use your cooldowns to get you to safety. You're better alive with no cooldowns than just dead. At least in a little while you'll be able to impact the fight instead of just being dead for like 50 seconds. I've seen way too many Khepris refuse to ult themselves when it won't save them just because they want to save it for a carry. Don't be that Khepri. Anyways, that's about it for the guide. Hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something from it. Apologies if this didn't go quite as in depth as my other ones. Support's more of a secondary role for me, with my primaries being solo and jungle. So if any support mains have extra tips, then be sure to leave them in the comment to add to the video. Anyway, leave a like if you enjoyed the guide and subscribe for more in the future. Share the video with anyone you think could benefit from it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out, nerds.